9 strange things your cat does without you, all about you. In this episode, we will discover 9 rarely known feline habits. There is a silent transformation that starts once you step out of the door, one that rarely shows itself obviously, however leaves behind clues that only make sense when you start looking backward instead of forward. Your home does not stay empty in the way you think it does, and your feline does not simply wait for your returning back in calmness. Something else happens in that period between departure and arrival, something subtle enough to miss, but consistent enough to leave patterns behind. Because when you are not home, your cat does not experience absence as emptiness. They experience it as change, and they begin to cope to that change in ways that are far more intentional than they first appear. The things that carry you. It often starts with objects that feel misplaced. A sock in a room it should never reach. A small item quietly relocated. A piece of fabric appearing somewhere new as if it has traveled on its own. At first glance, it looks like coincidence or simple play, but the repetition tells a different story, one tied deeply to how cats experience the world through scent and memory. Your scent does not vanish when you leave. It lingers in soft layers across fabric, furniture, and everything you have touched. And for your cat, these traces become something meaningful, something that replaces your immediate presence with something that still feels like you. So they move these objects not randomly, but toward places where they spend time, where they rest, where they can sit surrounded by what remains of you in the environment. What seems like a misplaced sock is, in their world, something closer to reconstruction, a way of reshaping absence into something that still feels occupied. The places they watch from. There is often a place your cat returns to without being asked, a window, a hallway, a corner that faces the direction you usually come from, and over time it becomes easy to assume it is just comfort or habit. But when observed closely, it begins to resemble something more structured, a quiet form of positioning that aligns with expectation rather than chance. Cats are deeply sensitive to patterns in their environment, not in the abstract sense, but in the physical rhythm of daily life, the timing of sounds, the shift of light, the familiar sequence of events that quietly builds the shape of a day. Within that structure, your return becomes part of the pattern they learn to anticipate. So they place themselves where that pattern becomes visible, where movement outside can be detected early, where sound carries a signal before it becomes presence. And when you finally arrive, what looks like calmness is often the end of something that has already been unfolding for some time. The quiet ways they regulate. Not everything your cat does in your absence is visible at first glance, because much of it is internal regulation expressed through ordinary behavior that only gains meaning when seen in context. Grooming, for example, becomes more than routine maintenance when the environment shifts and the house feels slightly different without your presence. In those moments, repetition becomes grounding, a steady physical rhythm that helps restore balance when external familiarity is temporarily reduced. It is not urgency but adjustment, a way of managing internal state through familiar action, something simple enough to repeat, yet meaningful enough to stabilize. When you return and notice subtle differences in their coat or posture, you are not seeing evidence of activity alone, but traces of how they manage the space between your absence and return. The spaces that hold you. Some places in your home carry more of you than others, not because they are important in themselves, but because they absorb repetition, scent, and stillness over time. Your bed, your pillow, the clothes you leave behind without thinking, all become quiet reservoirs of familiarity that remain long after you are gone. And when your cat chooses these spaces in your absence, it is not random preference, but something closer to seeking proximity in its most available form. They are not simply lying down, they are placing themselves in the closest version of your presence that the environment can offer. There is a kind of logic to it that is not spoken, a quiet understanding that closeness does not always require physical arrival, only trace. The movement you never see. While part of your cat settles into stillness, another part begins to move through the house in a way that rarely happens when you are present. Rooms are checked, thresholds are revisited, windows are approached and left again, forming loops that feel less like wandering and more like quiet assessment. This is not anxiety in the dramatic sense, but awareness, a sensitivity to the absence of routine confirmation, where the environment is not being ignored, but actively reviewed. Every space becomes slightly more significant when the usual anchor is missing. And when you return, that movement often dissolves without ceremony, as if the purpose behind it has quietly resolved itself. The way they reconnect. The moment you come back is not a single reaction but a transition that unfolds over time, beginning with recognition and slowly shifting into recalibration. Some cats approach immediately, others maintain distance at first, but what follows is often more telling than the greeting itself. Because after the initial moment passes, many begin to follow, not with urgency, but with continuity, staying near without necessarily demanding interaction. It is as if your return restores a reference point that had been temporarily absent, and proximity becomes a way of rebalancing that structure. The house feels different again, but this time in the opposite direction, not empty, but restored. The evidence that feels like a message. There are moments when objects appear in places that feel almost deliberate. A toy relocated to a specific corner, an item placed somewhere that seems to carry meaning beyond play. And while it is easy to interpret this as randomness, the behavior itself is rooted in instinct that predates domestic life. Cats do not only interact with objects for entertainment, they interact with them as substitutes for experience, carrying, placing, and depositing them in ways that mirror deeper behavioral patterns tied to hunting and social structure. In your home, those instincts do not disappear, they simply adapt, and what remains behind is a quiet version of that same logic, translated into domestic space. The sound you never hear. There is also a part of your cat's behavior that exists entirely outside your awareness, unfolding in the early moments after you leave, and then gradually dissolving into the background of the house long before you ever return. It does not present itself as something structured or dramatic, but as brief interruptions in silence, small vocalizations that rise and fall without any need for an audience, almost as if the sound itself is not meant to be heard so much as released into the space where you were only moments ago. Some cats vocalize in your absence in a way that is not about performance or attention-seeking, but about adjustment, a response to the sudden shift in the environment when the primary point of connection disappears from it. The house is still familiar, the objects are still in place, but the relationship between those objects and your presence has changed, and in that subtle disconnection, sound becomes a form of grounding, a way of filling the space that your movement usually occupies. These sounds rarely reach you directly, yet they are not without presence. They linger in a way that is more environmental than personal, absorbed into the structure of the home itself, carried through hallways, softened by distance, and eventually broken down into silence that feels complete from the outside. Sometimes only indirect traces remain, a neighbor mentioning faint meows at odd hours, or a camera capturing brief moments of movement accompanied by sound that feels unfamiliar when replayed later. The time they keep without you. Even in your absence, your cat does not lose its sense of rhythm, because routine is not dependent on observation, but on internalized sequence that becomes part of how they orient themselves within the day. Time, for them, is not abstract or measured in hours, but structured through repetition, through the familiar progression of light, sound, and expectation that builds a quiet map of what usually happens next. They move through the house in patterns that reflect this internal structure, returning to certain places not because they are instructed to, but because those places belong to specific moments within their understanding of the day. A window at a particular hour, a room that feels right for resting at a specific point, a corridor that becomes meaningful only because it aligns with something that used to include your presence. Over time, this creates a rhythm that is surprisingly stable, even in your absence, as if your shared routine continues to exist in a reduced form, with one element temporarily missing but not erased. The structure remains, and your cat continues to follow it, moving through familiar cycles as though still participating in something that includes you indirectly. When you begin to notice these patterns together, a different picture starts to form, one where absence is not absence at all, but a quieter form of presence expressed through movement, scent, and repetition. Your cat is not filling time in your absence. They are responding to it, shaping it, and anchoring themselves within it in ways that are easy to overlook until you know where to look. And once you do, even ordinary moments at home begin to feel slightly different, as if something unseen has been happening all along, just outside the edges of attention.